Around 1867, Joseph McCoy came to the decision that he would have to move westwards if he was going to link his cattle along the railroads. Joseph McCoy had to choose several different towns and cities to choose from to link the cattle with the railroads, and he finally decided that Abilene, Kansas would be where he would link the trails to the cattle and railroad depots to be shipped out eastwards. As a result, Abilene, Kansas would be linked with a trail that would be linked all the way southwards into Texas. Thanks to Joseph McCoy's efforts, there would now be cattle drives that would be trailblazed from Texas all the way up to Abilene, Kansas. It was the new cattle trail that Joseph McCoy formed from South Texas all the way northwards into Abilene, Kansas, that they named the Chisholm Trail. After the Civil War, the only resource that Texans really had were longhorns, and there were no markets available in that state to sell them at. So, in order to make a profit from these cattle that were in Texas, they were going to have to find a way to get these cattle all the way into the eastern market cities, such as Kansas City and Chicago. This is where Joseph McCoy had to come into play to help these Texans convince railroads such as the Kansas Pacific to lay tracks in Abilene, Kansas. What contributed to Abilene, Kansas's growth was because of the railroads that Joseph McCoy convinced the companies to bring in. Railroads would also be built west of Abilene, Kansas, in towns such as Ellsworth, Kansas, and Dodge City. Once the railroad was built in Abilene, there were businesses that spurred up and came into the community, such as hotels and saloons. It was between 1867 and 1871 that there were over 1 million longhorn cattle that were coming from Texas into Abilene, Kansas cattle stockyards. And once these cattle did come from Texas into Abilene, Kansas, they were loaded onto trains that were going to be shipped out eastwards towards the package plants. The cowboys on these cattle drives from Texas all the way towards Abilene, Kansas went against all these hazards and challenges because of the profit that they could make. Joseph McCoy had such a huge influence on Abilene, Kansas with the cattle industry and the railroads that even famous figures such as Wild Bill Hickok had actually moved and spent a brief period of time as a town marshal in Abilene. Hickok moved to Abilene, Kansas, actually when the cattle town was in its final stages. As the community of Abilene, Kansas kept booming, there was also violence and Wild West shootouts that came with these events, and Abilene, Kansas needed strong leaders such as Hickok to control the violence that had been occurring. Hickok had always been in a couple shootouts, and he always warned people that if they challenged the law, there could come consequences with it. With Joseph McCoy's widely success, it eventually led to his popularity when he became nominated to become the mayor of Abilene, Kansas in 1871. Also, another reason that Joseph McCoy was so popular in Abilene, Kansas was because of all the businesses that were thriving and booming at that time. McCoy's primarily main focus was to ensure that Abilene, Kansas was going to keep growing with prosperity, and he truly loved the entire community and wanted it to keep becoming one of the biggest cattle towns in the United States. It was in 1873 that an Illinois farmer named Joseph Glidden, who was actually also from the same state that Joseph McCoy grew up in and was born at. Well, Joseph Glidden invented the barbed wire, and this was because the citizens in Dickinson County, where Abilene, Kansas, and the cattle yards were situated at, well, these people were upset how these cattle drives from Texas were they were actually destroying their land and property from all the grazing from the cattle. Abilene, Kansas, and the counties that were out west would start using these barbed wire techniques to prevent the cattle from coming onto their land and destroying it. The barbed wire invention, along with all the pressure from the county's residents, put a huge stress and devastated McCoy's cattle industry and stockyards. Because of all the new barbed wire fencing and agricultural practices and techniques, Joseph McCoy had no choice and could no longer keep pursuing his cattle business, and he would have to move on to another position. Because Joseph McCoy lost most of his finances and stocks from the cattle drives that were coming into Abilene, Kansas, he then decided he would have to find a new interest, and that eventually became the barbed wire business, which coincidentally destroyed his cattle stockyards. Still, though, McCoy dreamed of getting back into the cattle business, and he still felt like it was in his heart, and the fencing business in Wichita, Kansas wasn't as compelling. McCoy then followed his heart and was able to manage to move to Kansas City, Missouri, and he became a cattle stockyard commissioner, along with a few other respectful positions, such as a secretary, and he also got to gain his passion back.